Welcome to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlsen, I'll be your host, as we take a close look at Mexico today through the eyes of the artists, experts, and decision makers who are shaping the nation, here on Telesur.
No aguantamos con las transnacionales, los altos costos de semillas, fertilizantes, agroinsumos.
We're here in Coyoacán in southern Mexico City to talk about the impact of the North American Free Trade Agreement on Mexico. 2 decades after it went into effect on January 1st, 1994, is Mexico worse off or better off? Who won and who lost? To talk about this issue, we're very fortunate to have with us today Jeff Faux. Welcome to Interview from Mexico.
It's great to be here.
Jeff is the author of Global Class War and a founder and fellow at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Jeff, I wanted to start out looking back to the early 90s when NAFTA was negotiated and promoted to all 3 countries. What were some of the promises that were made then?
Well, all of the leaders of the 3 countries promised jobs. Bill Clinton at one point promised Americans 1 million new jobs because of NAFTA. They promised jobs, they promised higher wages, they promised faster growth, and they promised that each of their countries would be more competitive. Now, one of the things that should have made us suspicious at the beginning was that the job promises were based on surpluses in trade. So essentially, each country was saying they were going to have a bigger surplus with the other 2 countries. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to understand that that can't possibly work. So we should have been suspicious from the beginning about these promises.
So I gather from what you're saying that these promises did not come true. Why not?
None of them came true. The United States actually lost jobs and workers in the United States lost wages. Workers in Mexico, some of them gained jobs, there's no question about that, on the Maquila and Maquiladora and other places, but there was a net loss, and in the farming area, at least 2 million farms were destroyed, so that you have this disaster that came from NAFTA. The promises were not really serious. I mean, now 20 years later, we can see that the promises were not serious. Number one, because it was mathematically impossible for these promises to be serious. But second, NAFTA was not a free trade agreement. It was not an agreement among nations. You know, we still think of it that way. We think of all of these trade agreements as agreements among separate nations. So who won, who lost? Did Mexico win or lose? But it wasn't a free trade agreement could have been written on 2 or 3 pages. Lower tariffs. But instead, it's 1,000 pages. So you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? And what was going on was an agreement between the rich and powerful in all 3 of those countries in order to further their mutual benefit, which was to reduce the bargaining power of workers in all 3 countries. And so we have the result that, for example, in Mexico and in the United States, wages continue to be stagnant in these in the export and import industries, whereas the productivity of the workers continued to rise, so that the workers were getting less of a share of the wealth they were producing in both countries. So if this was a contest or an agreement between the United States and Mexico, why were workers in both countries disadvantaged? And that's the question we need to ask now about NAFTA.
Well, if we take this frame that it's not so much between nations but an agreement for a transnational class, what are the sectors that have most benefited from NAFTA?
Well, the financial sector, by far the financial sector, because what NAFTA did was allowed the financial sectors in Mexico and the United States to escape the regulation and the connections with their home countries. So that it was more, it wasn't so much a trade agreement as an investment agreement. And so now we have Americans owning much more of Mexico than they did before, American investors, and we have Mexican investors owning more of America. Carlos Slim is the second largest shareholder in the New York Times. So you cannot look at this from simply Mexico, the United States. You've got to look at the classes that benefited. And the class that benefited was the investor class, and the class that lost was the working class on both sides of the border.
Well, let's go back to the working class and the workers. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's happened to Mexican workers since NAFTA?
Yeah, first of all, the Mexican workers in agriculture got blown away by NAFTA, because what happened was that the cheap grain, corn and wheat coming in from the United States, subsidized by the United States government, U.S. agribusiness, flooded Mexico and drove these farmers out of work. So you had suddenly this unemployment in rural areas, and the claim was that there'd be so much growth in Mexican industry that there would be new jobs for these people and better jobs than they had on the farm. Well, it turned out that Mexican industry did not grow enough to absorb all of these people. Plus, many medium-sized and smaller Mexican firms were run out of business by international competition. So the net was Mexico really had less capacity to employ its own people. And we know that has to be true because of the acceleration in out-migration to the United States. I mean, that, if you want one piece of evidence that this thing didn't work for Mexico, it's in those immigration numbers.
And one of the promises was that immigration would go down.
Absolutely. In a big meeting that Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton and George Bush, these ex-presidents, president and ex-presidents had before introducing NAFTA, Carter and Clinton said that this was going to mean less Mexican immigration into the United States. They promised that. And of course, the opposite happened. And what's tragic about all this is that we're not learning from the past. So NAFTA became the model for the next round of trade agreements, including the World Trade Organization, the deals that the United States made with China, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and now this new Transpacific Partnership, which is going to make the NAFTA model expand across the Pacific. So even a rat in a maze, after a while, gets the point, learns a lesson, where the electric shock is and where the cheese is. Well, we're still going right down the corridor into the electric shock.
Well, Jeff, let's pick up that point when we come back. We'll take a short break now and come right back. Welcome back. We're talking to Jeff Faux about the many negative impacts that NAFTA has had here in Mexico after 20 years. Jeff, I was wondering if you could tell us what are some of the sectors that have been hardest hit?
Well, the Mexican agricultural sector, certainly. The industrial sector in the United States, especially the electronics area, textiles, things of that sort. And the small businesses and the medium-sized business in Mexico across the board have been affected by the huge amount of investment and the opening up of their markets to U.S. products and services that in many cases are heavily subsidized by the U.S. government. So they call this free trade, free market, but in fact behind that freedom is a very manipulated market, especially on the part of the United States.
Well, another of the most notable consequences of 2 decades of NAFTA in both the United States and Mexico has been a real shrinkage of unions and their representation of workers in the workplace. Is this related to the agreement itself?
It's not only related, it was part of the main objective of NAFTA. I think you cannot explain the failure of NAFTA for the working people on both sides of the border without understanding that part of its purpose was to break the bargaining power of labor in Mexico and in the United States. And you can certainly see that that has succeeded because unions have become weaker on both sides. Now, what does that mean? That it's not only affecting workers who are in unions, but affects workers who are not in unions but whose wages were kept up because the bosses feared that if they didn't give them a raise, they'd join a union. And that whole system, which supported higher wages on both sides of the border, has really been destroyed. So now we have, one of the things that globalization has done is given more incentive for businesses to repress wages than to raise wages. When, without globalization, before NAFTA and the flowering of globalization, high wages were good for an economy because it meant that the workers had money in their pockets to buy the goods that they produced. Now, on both sides, Mexican workers have less money to buy the goods they produce. American workers have less money to buy the goods that they produce.
So is that sort of the race to the bottom that some people
That
warned
is
us?
exactly the mechanism of the race to the bottom. And that's why after 20 years, those promises of higher wages, more good jobs, Mexico would become a middle-class country that would absorb all of the goods and services of the United States. That whole model just evaporated.
Well, we recently saw statistics here in Mexico that there's been a rise in the working poor, and there's actually a campaign starting to raise the minimum wage. Traditionally, the government has had some capability to regulate working conditions and other aspects of the economy. Has NAFTA affected the ability of the government to regulate this?
Yes, and not only weakened the capacity of Mexico and the Mexican government and the American government to control international trade and investment, but also it sent a signal to the business people on both sides of the border that now government was not going to protect the people the way it had before. And so you see an erosion of protections for workers. Why is it that we have popular groups agitating both in Mexico and the United States for a rise in the minimum wage? It's because wages have been suppressed. And businesses now on both sides are competing on the basis of lower labor costs, which means lower wages. And so the increase in the working poor has occurred in both countries. And can I just add, it's not just, we think of the poor as people who are uneducated, unskilled. Increasingly, on both sides of the border, people who have gone to college, young people find it very, very hard to get a job. The jobs that they're taking now are jobs that don't need college educations. Where I live in Washington, D.C., I go into a restaurant, I've got people who have master's degrees, sometimes PhDs, waiting on me as waiters and waitresses. Why? Because they can't get jobs. Now, this is it's not all NAFTA's fault, but NAFTA was an instrument in the class struggle, if you were, on both sides of the border. And you ask if NAFTA was a failure or a success. Well, it was a success for the people at the top. But for the rest of working people, 80 to 90% of the population, it was a failure.
Here in Mexico, another one of what seems to be a consequence of 2 decades of the free trade agreement is that where there has been job growth, we've seen the job growth in the informal economy.
Yes.
And that's especially true for the integration of women into the economy. Is this also directly related to the terms of the agreement?
Yes, yes, absolutely. The message of NAFTA and the reality of NAFTA was that the market was going to rule the way it did in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. And the progress that had been made in controlling the market for the good of the people would be diminished. So what you have is the increase in informal labor. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean jobs without any security, jobs where you don't know from one week to another how many hours you're going to work, no pensions, no health care. Those are the jobs that are increasing, and jobs where the boss is absolutely king. And that's happening on both sides of the border. So the rise of the informal, they sold NAFTA as progress. This is going to be something that was going to create a better future. Instead, NAFTA in its essence is reactionary. We are going back to a world, an economic world that existed before World War II, before World War I even, where to be a labor organizer meant you were going to get beat up or end up with a bullet in your head in a ditch, and that there was no control and no restrictions on what the power of the boss was. So we're going back to that.
That's a very dramatic way of putting it. Thanks, Jeff. We'll take a short break now and come right back.
Nuestros presidentes mexicanos jamás consultan a su pueblo para contraer estos compromisos internacionales.
Talking to Jeff Faux about Mexico 2 decades after the North American Free Trade Agreement. Jeff, you mentioned that other agreements have been patterned on NAFTA despite negative results. One of the most important that we're facing today is the Transpacific Partnership. Can you tell us a little about this agreement, and is it modeled after NAFTA?
Well, it's certainly modeled after NAFTA. It involves 11 countries so far, although they think perhaps China may come into it later. But there are 11 countries that are around the Pacific Rim, and includes Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And it is a NAFTA-like treaty because, like NAFTA, it provides for protections for investors and for corporations. It provides for people aligned with corporations to sit on tribunals in order to resolve disputes. And it gives private corporations as much or more power than elected governments, so that it is, in one sense, it's NAFTA on steroids. It's even worse than NAFTA. So this is the kind of thing this kind of globalization that is being created on the germ and the embryo that was NAFTA. NAFTA really is what I think is an ugly vision for the future.
Well, Jeff, we've been talking a lot about the negative impact of this free trade model on the majority of the populations in all 3 countries. Are you saying that trade itself between nations is a bad thing?
No, there's nothing wrong with trade. Countries have been trading with each other for centuries. The U.S. and Mexico, before NAFTA, traded goods with each other. The problem is that NAFTA created new rules for trade, and rules that use trade as a way of changing the economic power structure in each of these countries. So there's nothing wrong with trade. Trade's a good idea. It's just how you trade and the rules of trade. And these rules of trade from NAFTA have been devised to benefit the people at the top, and the people at the middle and the people at the bottom have lost.
Well, with this dire evaluation after 2 decades of NAFTA, can NAFTA be fixed? Can it be renegotiated in a way that it's more beneficial for the majority of the population?
Well, you can imagine governments in the United States and Mexico having a different view of the world. In that case, a trade agreement between the United States and Mexico can be devised that would provide protections for workers, that would be based on an economic program that would value increasing wages and better working conditions for workers on both sides. And I think that clearly should be our goal. I mean, the enemy of the Mexican worker is not the American worker. The enemy of the American worker is not the Mexican worker. The enemy is the guy on top who has been suppressing the wages and working conditions of workers in both countries.
Well, are there groups in the United States, Canada, and Mexico who are opposing the free trade agreement and working to see some of these changes come about?
Yes, yes. Labor unions in all three countries, community groups in all three countries, religious groups in all three countries, and people who may not be affiliated with any of these organizations, but who, after 20 years, are beginning to ask themselves, well, was the package that we were sold with NAFTA, when we finally opened it up, was it good or bad? And are beginning to ask, well, if they lied about NAFTA, if they lied about the WTO, if they lied about the Central American Trade Agreement, then why wouldn't they be lying about the Transpacific Partnership? And I think that people's consciousness about this is changing, even among economists. Now, this is the hardcore group for whom free trade is a Bible, but you are beginning to see doubts rise in the minds of even establishment economists about how good NAFTA was. So I think people, finally, the rats may be knowing the difference between the cheese and the electric shock, and there's some hope for the future. But it requires hard political work and a different way of thinking about the relationships between Mexico and the United States, and especially about the relationship between people who work for a living and people who invest for a living.
Well, we've seen some of that organizing now taking place against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, yes, haven't we?
Yes.
Is there a chance that we could see new rules there or a different model come into being?
I think the first thing that has to be done is the Trans-Pacific Partnership has to be defeated. Because under the current political arrangement, there's no way that you can amend it here or change it a little bit there. The number one objective has to be to defeat that. And then when that's defeated, the powers that be in all of these countries might then come to the bargaining table. But first you have to stop them.
Well, there's certainly some powerful interests that are in favor of holding up this model, but a great deal of evidence that the results have not been good after 20 years here in Mexico for the vast majority of the population. Jeff Faux, thank you very much for joining us here on Interview from Mexico.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for being here with us. We'll be back again next week here on Interview from Mexico.